All right, now we're recording. Remark 1. It is customary to oppose nothing to something. Something is, however, already a determinate existent that distinguishes itself from another something. Consequently, the nothing which is being opposed to something is also the nothing of a certain something, a determinate nothing. Here, however, the nothing is to be taken in its indeterminate simplicity. If it is deemed more correct to oppose non-being to being instead of nothing, there is no objection to this as regards the result, which, since in non-being there is contained the reference to being. Non-being is both being and its negation as said in 1, nothing as it is in becoming. But the issue, first of all, is not the form of opposition, which is at the same time the form of reference, but the abstract immediate negation, the nothing purely for itself, negation devoid of reference, and this can also be expressed, if one so wishes, simply by saying nothing. So the problem with non-being is the way you say it already refers back to being. Hegel doesn't want you to think in nothing. You're not supposed to think nothing in opposition to being. You're supposed to think nothing as nothing. So that's why non-being, though its meaning technically is right, the way you say it is tricky because it already makes you think of something else. It refers back to something else, so it already has determinacy. It's saying too much. Because when he says non-being is both, being in its negation, it's literally right there. Non-being. You're saying being which is not, or it's you've already said it in the very phrase, the unity, which you actually don't want to say. You're saying too much. So, big thing to note. Being and nothing are not opposites. They are not opposites. At this point in the logic, we just have a shift from being as absolute to nothing as absolute. They are not a dialectic contradiction. The only way they turn into a dialectic contradiction is actually, this is something I want to touch upon, which is it's an external reflection. Because sure, you think being, and its content ends up being that you think of nothing. There is no thinking to be had in being, and you turn that into a thought. But that is no content. It's the same contentlessness. So there is no opposition. There's just this shift from one thought to another. But these thoughts are indeterminate. They got no content. So you just know that you mean two different things, but you don't actually know what the hell the difference is other than an external reference. You're the one who judges that this is being and that is nothing. They actually have no content to differentiate. So in the dialectic of being, calling it the content of being nothing is just, the name fits, but we don't know what it means. And to go back from nothing to being, which is by saying nothing is, that doesn't come out of nothing. That is actually an external reflection of you noticing the general form of nothing, which is why Hegel notes on be nothing. Insofar as mention can be made here of intuiting and thinking, it makes a difference whether something or nothing is being intuited or thought. To intuit or to think nothing has therefore a meaning. The two are distinguished, and so nothing is, concretely exists, in our intuiting or thinking, or rather it is the empty intuiting and thinking itself, like pure being. Nothing is therefore the same determination or absence of determination, and thus altogether the same as what pure being is. But notice that to say nothing is doesn't come out of nothing. We can't think nothing. Like we thought being. Out of being, we at least could think nothing, and we made that into a new thought. If you try to think nothing, you're not going to get anything new. You're not going to get flung back to being, which is strange. So Hegel's, you have to notice that Hegel here is using tricks to get us to move. No, it's not that it skips a process. It has a process which nothing doesn't. It's already saying too much. You want to say as little as possible with nothing, which is why you just want to deal with it in purity. So just keep that in mind. Being and nothing are not a real dialectic. They aren't actual opposites at this point. They are just two different name concepts that we have for we don't know what. So they actually don't shift naturally. It's a forced shifting. Being can shift to nothing, but nothing at this point does not shift back to being without an external reflection. You can't think nothing and get back to being unless you reflect on the form, but you don't have that as a given within nothing itself. Yeah, so we'll keep going. We were on. Yeah, we were on 2172, page 61. So, if the result that being and nothing are the same seems inherently startling or paradoxical, there is not much to be done about it. We should be amazed rather at this amazement that appears so refreshing in philosophy but forgets that the determinations that occur in the science of logic are quite different from those so-called common sense, which is not exactly sound understanding, but an understanding schooled rather in abstractions and in the belief in abstractions, or more accurately, in the superstitious belief in them. It would not be difficult to demonstrate the unity of being and nothing in every example, in every actual thing or thought. The same must be said of being and nothing as was said above of immediacy and mediation, which contain a reference to each other and hence negation. That nowhere on heaven or on earth is there anything which does not contain both being and nothing in itself. '61 of the book, not the PDF. I don't know why my PDF reader doesn't show the pages for this specific PDF. Yeah. All right. To be sure, since we are speaking here of a certain something and a certain actual thing, those determinations are no longer present in the complete untruth in which they are as being and nothing. They are rather present in some more advanced determination and are grasped, for example, as positive or negative, the one as reflected being and the other as reflected nothing. But the positive contains being and the negative contains nothing as their abstract foundation. Thus, even in God, quality carries essentially the determination of the negative, activity, creation, power, so forth, are the bringing forth of an other. But an empirical elucidation of the claim by means of examples would be entirely superfluous here, for from now on this unity of being and nothing will stand once and for all as foundation, as first truth, and will thus constitute the element of all that follows. All further logical determinations, besides becoming itself, existence, quality, and in general all the concepts of philosophy, are therefore examples of this unity. As for that sense that styles itself as common or sound, if it rejects the inseparability of being and nothing, let it try to produce an example in which the one is found separate from the other. Let it separate something from limit or limitation, or, as just said, the infinite God from activity. Only the empty figments of thought, being, and nothing, only these are separate things, and they are the ones which are accorded priority by common sense over truth, the inseparability of which is everywhere before us. So, something to note here is important, which is Hegel tells us being and nothing are in the way that we start here, unreal. They're not real concepts. They're not real thoughts, and we find that there's obviously something fishy about it. We have how can we have indeterminate thoughts? Like everything else we think about is determinate. There is a mix between being and nothing, and yet we somehow assume that it could make sense to talk about pure being and pure nothing as two completely different and separate things.
I think for the moment he's saying in some way that they are anyway, in some way, just abstract tools of the mind to refer to certain properties of things, but yet they are not real properties, just analytical tools.
Can you set your microphone to push to talk, Daedalus? So yeah, once again to reiterate, being and nothing, not a real dialectic. As a matter of fact, this is just my own comment. I actually haven't read any commentaries to know. I'm pretty sure someone must notice this. Like, it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch in which this beginning so-called dialectic of being and nothing, it's a false dialectic, and it actually is the last dialectic in the kind that you will find in, say, the phenomenology of spirit, the philosophy of history, all these other things in which you end up creating, you end up finding out the real structure of it by thinking through this abstraction. So the abstraction itself is not going to be true, but what is implicit in the relation of the abstraction will reveal the truth, and the truth is going to be here becoming. So continuing, we cannot hope to address all the confusions in which ordinary consciousness lands itself in connection with this logical proposition, for they are inexhaustible. Only a few can be cited. One cause among others of such confusions is that consciousness brings with it, to such an abstract logical proposition, the figure of some concrete thing, forgetting that the issue here is not anything concrete, but only the pure abstractions of being and nothing, and that these alone are to be held firmly in mind. So once again, the repetitions, actually he'll name a few in the following remarks. But I mean, just think about the so-called, the abstraction of matter, for example, in which you say, well, everything is matter. So it doesn't even make sense to oppose anything to matter, because everything ultimately reduces to matter. It's all just mattering. But if you really think about it in its true absolute sense, what in the world does this mean? We don't know. It's actually indeterminate for us. We have no idea what in the world it means. It makes no sense to us. Yet we talk about it so easily, as if it is just kind of obvious what it is. So, being and non-being are the same. Therefore, it is the same. Sorry, I'll be right back. Dang dog. Therefore, it is the same whether I am or am not, whether this house is or is not, whether these $100 are in my possession or not. This conclusion from the proposition, or this application of it, alters its meaning completely. The proposition contains the pure abstractions of being and nothing, but the application makes of them a determinate being and a determinate nothing. But as we have said, determinate being is not an issue here. A determinate, a finite being, is one that refers to another. It is a content that stands in the relation of necessity to another content, to the whole world. As regards the reciprocal determinations that hold the whole together, metaphysics could only make the basically tautological claim that if one speck of dust were destroyed, the whole universe would collapse. Actually, here he's taking a dig at something Kant says. And it's not really a dig, he's actually agreeing with Kant. Because Kant said, look, Kant was attacking the ontological argument, which is the idea that if you add a being or existence to a concept, it makes it mean something more, as if it adds content. And Kant's whole thing is like, well, no, it doesn't. Saying that something is or is not doesn't change the meaning. It doesn't actually have any propositional content to it. So in pure abstraction, Kant got what being and nothing, had to be. He couldn't tell, what it means to say, well, I have $100 and I don't have $100 in abstract. $100 are, $100 are not. Does it make $100 mean more? No. As a matter of fact, we don't know. We don't really see what they mean in abstract. He here, if in regards to form and content, he would actually say they have none. They actually don't, because they don't have content. They can't actually be forms, which is why they're indeterminate. We don't even know what we're talking about. We've given them names and we intend something by them, but what we intend, we have no clue. In abstraction. Like, once you start talking about actual defined determinate things, it's no problem. You actually know exactly what you mean. But when it's a confusion of language. This is actually a pretty Wittgensteinian point, in which if you don't realize what is happening in the way that you're saying things, you can make these weird mistakes in thinking that you can say something like pure being and pure nothing and believe that you're saying something meaningful when in reality you're not. Language betrays what you intend. Okay, continuing. In the instances adduced against our proposition, something appears as not indifferent to whether it is or is not on account of being or non-being, but because of its content, which connects it with some other content. If a determinate content, some determinate being, is presupposed, this being, since it is determinate, stands in a manifold reference to another content. It is not a matter of indifference. To it whether a certain other content to which it refers is or is not, for only through such a referring is it essentially what it is. The same applies to representing, inasmuch as we take non-being in the determinate sense of representing as contrasted with actuality, in this case the being or the absence of a content, which is a determinate representation that refers to another, is not a matter of indifference. So in pure abstraction, being and nothing, we can't see any difference, doesn't seem to matter. But once you start talking about things that are determinate, which are defined, you're already talking about a context, and suddenly being and non-being very much matter. when you're really talking about like the real significance of things, you're talking about like truly what you could call the conditions of existence. So you're talking about I'm a human being, and and I exist, and what does it actually take to exist? That a human being is a certain kind of entity, has a certain bodily shape or blah blah blah. If you don't have certain things, it doesn't actually make sense. If you say, well, suppose that the world stopped existing, well, you can actually already from that deduce that you also wouldn't exist, because you're part of this world, you depend on it. So once you start getting these content dependencies in which things are imminently linked, being and nothing start mattering very much. It actually does mean something. It starts meaning the presence or absence of a certain content, and without that content, you either do or you do not have certain things. Certain things are possible, certain things are not. As far as the term representing, take it as exactly what you would think in normal days. Something that represents is something that isn't exactly what you're referring to, but it kind of links you to it. Representation was the general idea that was common back in Hegel's day about what thinking was, at least for Kantians. For Hegel, thinking is not going to be a representation. Continuing, this observation already contains what constitutes a capital point in the Kantian critique of the ontological proof of God's existence, although we only consider it here with reference to the distinction that comes up in it of being and nothing in general, and of determinate being or non-being. As we know, that so-called proof presupposed the concept of a being that possesses all realities, including, therefore, concrete existence, which it likewise assumed as one of the realities. Kant's critique took mainly the line that existence, or being, the two taken here as synonymous, is not a property or a real predicate, that is to say, not a concept of something that can be added to the concept of a thing. What Kant means to say is that being is not a content determination. Therefore, he goes on, the possible does not contain more than the actual. 100 actual dollars do not contain a whit more than 100 possible ones. That is, the actual 100 have no other content determination than the possible. And in fact, considered in isolation, it is a matter of indifference to its content whether it is or is not. There is no distinction of being and non-being in it. This distinction does not affect it at all. The $100 do not become less if they do not exist, or more if they do. Any distinction would have to originate from elsewhere. So just to make it clear, Hegel here is agreeing that being and nothing are not a property or predicate of things. I mean, it actually makes perfectly good sense, because in order to have a property or predicate, you already have to be a being. Being is what enables things to have properties and predicates. So, strangely enough, pure being and pure nothing are going to be found by us in this investigation that they precede determinate being. Well, here it's in this translation, it's translated as existence, which is basically just say something that actually has a definable content, a real content. It also implies something important, which is obviously determinate things themselves cannot be made from determinate things. They actually have to arise out of indeterminate elements, as little sense as that seems to make to us. Or, just to put it in more standard common terms, what is definable itself, what makes a definition itself cannot be formed out of things which ultimately are defined. Definition comes out of the undefined. Continuing, but in my financial state, Kant reminds us there is more to 100 actual dollars than there is to the mere concept of them, that is, their possibility. For with actuality, the intended object is not merely included in my concept analytically, but is synthetically added to my concept, which is a determination of my state, without the thought itself of the $100 being in the least increased by this being which they have outside my concept. Here, two kinds of states, to retain Kantian expressions which are not free of confused awkwardness, are presupposed. One that Kant calls concept, by which we must understand representation, and another my financial state. For the one as for the other, for the finances and the representation, the $100 are a content determination, or they are added to each synthetically, as Kant puts it. I, as possessing $100, or as not possessing them, or again I, as representing $100 to myself, or as not representing them, is of course a different content. Stated more generally, the abstractions of being and nothing both cease to be abstractions by receiving a determinate content. Being is then reality, the determinate being of $100, and nothing is negation, the determinate non-being of the same dollars. This determinate content itself, the $100 also abstracted by itself, is unaltered the same in the one as in the other. But when being is further taken as a financial state, the $100 refer to this state, and so for this state their determinate content is not a matter of indifference. Their being or non-being is only an alteration. They are transposed into the sphere of existence. It's the translation. The actual term should have been Thalers. That was a German currency at the time, but they translate it as dollars. So actually, let's see. There's a bit of unpacking to do here. I guess you have to really pay attention to this whole synthetic and immanent and possessing and representing issue. So Hegel says Kant makes a presupposed distinction between concept, or the representation of the dollars, and another is the financial state. For the one as for the other, for the finances and the representation, the $100 are a content determination, or they are added to each synthetically, as Kant puts it. I as possessing $100, or as not possessing them, or again I as representing $100 to myself, or as not representing them, is of course a different content. So it's different kinds of it's two different kinds of being. Representation is one kind of being, possessing is another kind of being for $100. So the context changes the content of what is being. So he says, continuing, this determinate content itself, the $100, are also abstracted by itself, is unaltered, the same in the one as in the other. So there's a difference between my relating to the $100 and that their being in that relating, and just the concept of $100 in pure abstraction. To the $100 in pure abstraction, the relation seems to be completely external, has nothing to do with it. Whether it is or is not doesn't change the concept. But when being is further unaltered, the same in the one as in the other. But when being is further taken as a financial state, the $100 refer to this state, or for this state, their determinate content is not a matter of indifference. Their being or non-being is only an alteration. They are transposed into the sphere of existence. So in pure abstraction, $100, whether you say it is or is not, doesn't matter. But suddenly when you put a context and you say $100 is or are not, it changes the concept. It changes the concept, because 100 existing dollars means things which 100 non-existing dollars in a financial state does not.
So could we re re rethink about this in relation to the ontological proof? I'm not sure if I'm getting it in a certain way.
Yeah, hold on, because that's coming. He'll mention it in the next paragraph, I think.
Okay, I'll wait. I'll wait.
Yeah, here he's just talking about how Kant is right, but he's also wrong about being and nothing as predicates being contentless, because in pure abstraction, Kant is right. Pure, Kant is focusing a lot on the concept, but he's not noticing that context changes concept. That perhaps not like in the concept itself, but definitely in the ways in which this concept can interact. 100 represented dollars has a different interaction in context than 100 existing dollars in context. One can enable certain possibilities which the other cannot. Actually, he'll mention it in this. He says their being or non-being is only an alteration. They are transposed into the sphere of existence. When it is therefore urged against the unity of being and nothing that it is not a matter of indifference whether this or that, the $100, are or are not, the deception is to project a difference, whether I have or do not have the $100, into the difference merely of being and non-being. And this is a deception. Let's see. I think that example is different. When you say, I can say every centaur has 6 limbs, and this is true, but of course, there are no centaurs in actual existence. That's a whole. I think that's a whole different problem as opposed to this one, in which we're kind of talking about. You can define a centaur, and you don't even care about the truth. You just have this. You define the concept, and you say, is or is not. Does the concept mean something? Here, let me expand on this problem. This problem comes from Kant, and it's called the problem of analytic and synthetic a priori. Analytic a priori concepts don't go beyond themselves. It's basically a definition. When you define an analytic concept, are you adding something to it? When you say all bachelors are unmarried men, have you added something to the concept of bachelor? And Kant will say, no, you haven't, because all you've done is actually extract the immanent content and just made it explicit. So this is just unpacking what is already there. Synthetic concepts are concepts which add something. So, God, what was it? Well, it's like putting things in context. like having $100, in a certain context, and you say, well, I have $100 and there's a restaurant, therefore I can buy food. That's a synthetic unity of concept, which has changed the content. Right, it makes a difference, the fact that you have $100, say, for example, in the US, or $100 in Africa. Maybe in Africa they don't accept dollars, they have their own currency, so your money is worthless. The context matters, but it doesn't matter to the concept itself. The $100 are still $100. The difference is just an external difference. It's you can synthetically modify the concept, but it's only external. And that's all this really has to do with at this point. That being and nothing are not considered by Kant to be actually adding anything. They don't add anything both analytically, obviously, in pure abstraction, and they don't add anything synthetically. It seems he thinks to think. And Hegel's saying, well, obviously that's false. Because you can notice that it makes a big difference between saying you have $100 and there's a restaurant and they accept dollars, or a restaurant in the US, and you're walking by, and it makes a difference between saying you do or you do not have $100, because it enables certain things to happen or not. It changes the content of what is possible, what the proposition may mean. So that's really what the problem is. If that makes sense, if it doesn't make sense, I can try to clarify it further. Well, so long as it makes sense, because this has to, you have to get this in the proper context, at least, in which, if you don't know exactly what he's talking about, you definitely get misunderstandings of where this is coming from and where it's going. So, just to recollect on what the whole issue has been up to so far, the issue is that in pure abstraction, yes, being and nothing are not predicates. They don't mean anything. But in contexts, they do work as predicates. But, big difference, it is not in the capacity of being and nothing. It's actually in the capacity of existence and the non-being, which are determinate. So, this is it's using a whole different set of determinate categories, which being and nothing are not. Being and nothing only apply to this pure indeterminacy. But when you bring it into determinacy, you're just no longer talking about being and nothing. So that has to be clear. So continuing, page 64. When it is therefore urged against the unity of being and nothing that it is not a matter of indifference, whether this or that, the $100 are or are not, the deception is to project the difference, whether I have or do not have the $100, into the difference merely of being and non-being. This is a deception, as we have shown, based on a one-sided abstraction that leaves out the determinate existence present in such examples and retains only being and non-being. Just as, conversely, it transforms the abstract being and non-being that should be apprehended into a determinate being or non-being, into an existence. Only existence contains the real distinction of being and nothing, namely a something and an other. This real distinction is the one that comes to mind in representation instead of that of abstract being and nothing and their merely intended distinction. So, repeating again what I've already mentioned, which is being and nothing are not opposites. We don't actually know what they mean, and the reason we find that Kant can say what he says and be, convincing about it is because in abstraction, he is absolutely right. Being and nothing seem to mean nothing. They seem to have no content. So when we say, $100 are or are not in abstraction, we find exactly that we don't mean anything more or less. So it doesn't seem to add anything. It has no content. Of course, this ends up betraying the actual pointlessness or actual point of actual determinate things, because implied in this is also that not only being and nothing don't mean anything and are contentless, but the very things which we think we can speak of an abstraction really cannot be spoken of an abstraction. You cannot speak of $100 in pure abstraction from a world in which finances exist. You can't speak of $100 in a world in which, say, the United States doesn't exist, because then you don't have the currency called the dollar. You have pounds, you have pesos, you have these other things, but you don't have dollars. You don't have a world where money exists, you don't have dollars. So dollars already can't even be spoken about in abstraction. It doesn't make sense. I mean, is that clear to you guys? The reason Kant went further in saying things like this is, I think, because he was particularly worried about this whole analytic synthetic issue. Part of the project of his critique of pure reason was to show that the synthetic a priori, the purely rational, like synthetic concept which come together and add something more, are possible. But this particular critique comes in part of the critique of pure reason, where he's critiquing people who go too far with trying to prove metaphysical things like God, and he says that's just illegitimate. This critique about being and being as predicate is basically to critique people who go too far with reason and aren't critical enough. And it was a good critique for what he was critiquing. So it wasn't anything crazy. It was actually very well reasoned. But Kant just didn't see his own falling into this abstraction. I mean, the main thing to take out of the discussion I've just made is determinate things cannot be abstracted. Cannot. If you think they can, you are mistaken and you have deceived yourself.
Yeah, I think it was pretty good. Uh, I mean, I'm trying to see what Kant was criticizing. For example, uh, the very simple definition Spinoza had about God said, by God I mean a being absolutely infinite, that is a substance consisting in infinite attributes, of which each expresses eternal and infinite essentiality. And yeah, you can see how Kant's critique applies perfectly here. um, because in the in by Spinoza's account, when you could when you could had that concept, you already proved the existence of God, because the concept involved existence in itself. And yeah, that didn't make sense because of uh, being not being, or existence of being as such, being in itself, not being something which could be predicated.
Yeah. Let's move on to the next paragraph, and you'll see Hegel's retort to Kant's critique of that. So continuing, as Kant puts it, through existence, something enters into the context of the whole experience. We obtain one more object of perception, but our concept of the intended object is not thereby augmented. This only means, as follows from our explanation, that through existence, essentially because something is a determinate existence, this something is in relationship to others, and also to a perceiver among these others. The concept of $100, Kant says, is not augmented through perception. By concept is meant here the above noted $100 represented in isolation. As so isolated, these dollars are indeed an empirical content, but cut off without connection or determinateness as against something else. Their form of immediate self-identity deprives them of external connection and makes them indifferent to whether they are perceived or not. This so-called concept of $100 is, however, a false concept. The form of simple self-reference does not belong to such a limited, finite content itself. It is a form on loan to it, like a dress, by subjective understanding. $100 is nothing self-referring, but something alterable and perishable. So what is Hegel saying here? Hegel says Kant does not understand what existence is. Kant thinks existence has to do with empirical, just like this purely empirical existence kind of thing. You know, and people make this mistake, and it's a very natural mistake to make in the very way we talk about it, because we don't make this difference between being, existence, and determinacy. And for Hegel, existence specifically makes most sense as referring to determinacy itself. For something to exist is for something to come into context and therefore gain definition. So for Hegel, being a thought is an existence. Being a concept is an existence. And how does that come about? Obviously, because we have society, because we exist, because we think. You can't have these things in true abstraction. Impossible. So keep that in mind. The very fact of definition is existence. For Hegel, there's what you normally would call existence. In this particular translation of the Science of Logic is called concrete existence, and this is related to later in the second book to relations of essence, in which you have possibility and actuality, concrete existence, and just like essential existence, not yet come into being, etc. The point about how existence is a form on loan to abstract ideas like dollars is very important. Notice, and here's why. The reason why you can't speak of determinate things that are finite in this way, and this is important, finite, is that these finite things are not causa sui. They are not self-generated. They are not actually absolute. They are relative to the context. And this is why Hegel is going to retort in the next paragraph we're about to read. I think here Hegel's critique is that existence for Kant was mistaken to be this the empirical existence, just like the sensuous existence. When you say like, oh, well, that doesn't really exist. What you mean is, it doesn't exist out there. It doesn't empirically exist, doesn't spatially exist, doesn't isn't an actual object that is independent. It's just a figment of your imagination. But of course, it's kind of also returned in vogue today, which with stuff like object-oriented ontology, in which the retort is, well, obviously they exist. At least they exist in your head, right? It's a thought. Obviously exists. It doesn't have the same existence as something out there, but it exists. Continuing on, so this is where it starts to get interesting. This thinking or imagining which has before it only a determinate being, existence, must be referred back to the previously mentioned beginning of science which Parmenides made, the one who purified and elevated to pure thought to being as such his own otherwise pictorial representations, and hence also those of posterity, thus ushering in the element of science. What is the first in science had of necessity to show itself to be the first historically. And we must regard the one or the being of the Eleatics as the first instance of knowledge by thought. Water and such like material principles are indeed meant to be universal, even though, as things material, they are not pure thoughts. Numbers are neither the first simple nor the self-abiding thought, but thought rather which is entirely self-external. In here you can see a particular critique about the misunderstanding of what really is valuable in philosophy, which is ultimately thought. What you want to know is the concept, and the reason why Hegel's praising Parmenides here is because Parmenides is the first one, at least for the Western tradition, who gets right down to it and just dispenses with referring to anything else but a thought for the first time. He talks about being, pure being, and just that it's not. He doesn't say everything is water. He doesn't say everything is God. He doesn't say everything is numbers. He doesn't say everything is matter. He just says being is. That's it. Pure concept. So Parmenides isn't relying on anything that's experientially given as a sensuous experience. He's just relying on the pure concept of it. And for Hegel, this is what true philosophy is about, getting at the real concept of things, what is truly intelligible. And this, by the way, also gets to the heart of attacking something, say, like mysticism, in which one will say not anything particularly sensuous, not one particular sensuous existence, but they will reduce things to an experience of ineffability or unity, which still relies on consciousness. Yeah, it's not elevating to the pure science of thought. Parmenides was the first one dealing with a true a priori. He wasn't relying on anything sensuous to give him this idea. It wasn't burdened with a specific sensuous form. It was purely theoretical, purely conceptual. Continuing, the move from particular finite being to being as such in its totally abstract universality is to be regarded not only as the very first theoretical demand, but also as the very first practical one. For when a lot of fuss is made about the $100, that it does not make a difference, that it does make a difference to my financial state, whether I have them or not, still more whether I am or am not, or something else is or is not, we can then be reminded that the human being, quite apart from such financial situations, in which the possession of $100 will in fact be a matter of indifference, ought to raise his mind to this abstract universality in which it is in fact indifferent to him whether the $100, whatever the quantitative relation they might have to his financial state, are or are not, just as it would be indifferent to him whether he himself is or is not, that is, whether he is or is not in finite life, by which is meant a state, a determinate being, and so on. Si fractus ilebatur orbis impavidum ferint ruina, a Roman even said, and still more ought the Christian to find himself in this state of indifference. That Latin translates to if the world were to fall to pieces, the ruins would still sustain the undaunted. So basically, I mean, it's a jab at people who can't get into this element of pure abstraction, who are afraid of it, who think that if you were to let go of sensuous existence, you have nothing. And indeed, I mean, I think that was a part of the big counterattack against Parmenides as well, in which people said, okay, fine, you say being is, but what the hell does that mean? You've got a whole bunch of nothing. And yet Parmenides thought obviously he was saying something very meaningful. Even though he didn't have the tools to really articulate beyond just saying being is. He knew there was a meaning to that. So to tie that into what this discussion is going on to, this beginning with abstraction of pure abstraction, which seems to be so utterly worthless because it has no content, is a necessary step that we have to take. We have to get into this pure indeterminate abstraction, even though it seems to us from within that what did we do? How the hell can we move forward when we have nothing to think? How can we do philosophy if we're going to be stuck at being and nothing? And obviously Hegel's implying here his own method, which is we're not going to be stuck in it. We can move forward. Seemingly impossible as it is to start with indeterminacy and go to determinacy. All right, let's go to the next one. Also something to keep note of, Hegel keeps harping on about particularities and finitude. This whole argument that Kant makes against the ontological argument, Hegel's about to tell us this only works for particular finite things. It's not gonna. He thinks that this doesn't work against infinite things. So, unless you have questions, well, if you have questions, just type it out, and I'll get to it once I finish this paragraph. So, continuing. Still to be noted is the immediate connection between, on the one hand, the elevation above the $100 and finite things generally, and on the other hand, the ontological proof and the mentioned Kantian criticism of it. This criticism, because of its popular example, has one universal plausibility. Who does not know that 100 actual dollars are different from 100 merely possible dollars, and that they make a difference to my financial situation? This difference is easily demonstrable in the case of the $100. Therefore, the concept, that is, the determinateness of the content as empty possibility and being, are different from each other. Therefore, the concept of God and his being are also different. And just as I cannot extract from the possibility of the $100 their actuality, I can just as little extract God's existence from his concept. But the ontological proof consists precisely in thus extracting God's existence from his concept. Now, though there is of course truth to the claim that the concept is different from being, God's difference from the $100 and other finite things is yet greater. It is the definition of finite things that in them concept and being are different, that the concept and reality, soul and body, are inseparable, that they are therefore perishable and mortal. The abstract definition of God, on the contrary, is precisely that his concept and his being are unseparated and inseparable. The true critique of the categories and of reason is just this: the acquaint cognition with this distinction and to prevent it from applying to God the determinations and the relations of the finite. So, notice here, and I think at face value, this actually should make sense to you. Really. Because the whole difference between a finite and infinite thing is really important. It's one thing to talk about something in the universe to exist, and then to talk about the universe as, like, say, the totality of existence. And by totality, I mean the real totality, which includes possibility and actuality and all these other things. And then to dare say that that does not exist is utterly insane. Because whatever exists in and of itself, of its own power. There can be no difference between, the conception of, like, the absolute which we can have and the reality of the absolute. For us, making the finite opposition, though, it seems to make sense to make this distinction of, if I have the concept of a universe, doesn't mean that universe exists. But Hegel would say, and counter said, then you're not conceiving of the real universe. You're not conceiving of the real God. Because if you did, you would realize it just makes no sense to say it does not exist. It has to exist. It is, the being in and for itself. It exists of its own account. Yada, yada, yada. Oh yeah, Hegel is definitely no regular Christian, if one could call him a Christian at all. Because the moment you start talking about a real infinite, and by infinite I mean something, Hegel also means something that's unbounded, something which has nothing beyond it. You're necessarily talking about something that has to be. You cannot make this difference between, it could be or could not be. In order for it not to be, you'd have to have nothing, which itself then would be. And you can't get out of that circle. It would be strange, and it's actually nonsensical. Yeah, but it's always in dialectical unity with a finite. Yes, so finite things, one could say the finite forms of God obviously have a difference between concept and their existence, or their being. But God being the very entire ground, say, the condition of possibility, which is everything, obviously must exist. Even if you make this distinction between, there could be nothing rather than something, or, the ground of something is really nothing, then that nothing itself, must be. It has to be. Yeah, Kant does fall into mysticism. Actually, I noticed that before I even knew Kant very well. But the whole noumenal phenomenal divide is so in tune with mysticism. It's it's kind of funny. You can very easily be a Kantian and be a mystic who believes that reality and truth is utterly ineffable and undefinable. Truly a thing in itself, which is unknowable by reason. So that last bit about the true critique of the categories and of reason is just this: to acquaint the cognition with this distinction and to prevent it from applying to God the determinations in the relations of the finite. He's basically talking about what the project of the logic is in part, which is that the logic is the infinity of thought within itself. And so insofar as thought has this infinity, thought is obviously, if you know a bit about Hegelianism, Hegel basically, makes some shining and pacing back and forth, kind of uncomfortable, and straight out saying it in most everywhere else, which is God is thinking. God really is thought, and part of it is why? Because in thought, in concepts, you don't have a distinction between being and concept. A thought is being. That's it. Thinking is being, and it's unproblematic, at least within itself. Once you start trying to compare to something else, you start seeing discrepancies, but within itself, it's perfectly makes sense. Obviously, thinking is being. It won't fall into solipsism because thinking has an immediately negative. It has a negative power. In being, it becomes. Its becoming is its being, and it's you have this whole from the get-go. You're going to have being. You have this incessant going beyond itself in the very fact that it is what it is. So for Hegel, we're going to get out of the solipsism of thought precisely because thought has the power to become other than what it is.
Sorry, before we advance in Remark 2, could we recapitulate the conclusion of the last that was said?
Just recap Remark 1.
Yeah. But most of all, page 66. I'm still not seeing clearly in what he agrees and in what he disagrees with Kant.
Okay, so he agreed with Kant in that, yes, in pure abstraction, being and non-being don't have a content. They don't apply as predicates. But that's what we find out with being and nothing. It's like in pure abstraction, things don't mean anything. He disagrees with Kant in that this can make sense to carry over when talking about determinate things. Determinate things aren't just being and nothing. They're always unities. Things that already have context and are defined already are and are not at the same time. So, you can't abstract them into being and nothing because they're already inevitably mixes of these things. They themselves are not indeterminate, unlike being and nothing, which are indeterminate. So he disagrees in that. Once you start talking about determinate things, you really aren't talking about being and nothing anymore. You're talking about specific modes of higher categories, which are, denoting new kinds of being and nothing in a way. As far as the ontological critique of the ontological proof of God, he disagrees that it works because the ontological proof of God is right insofar as it really is talking about God as not a being, but really being in total. There is no way for being to not be. Cannot be possible, does not make sense. You cannot be talking about the true infinite in which nothing escapes it, in which everything is within it, and say that there is some way to differentiate between concept and existence. Clearly being is. That is just what it is. You can't say it's not. It doesn't make sense. You can only start, in order for being to not be, it would have to be in a internal self-reference of being. You see how it works, that nothing only makes sense in a reflexive differentiation from being. It's a jump from being, yet it's still within being.
So in the end, it's like he agreed with the critique of what Kant was criticizing as God, as universal, but he is saying what Kant is criticizing is not the relevant notion, not the already developed notion of being. So that's why his critique of the ontological proof is correct in the first way in which we talked about, but it is incorrect in the way in which being is now going to be developed.
Yeah. So, Kant is partially correct, in recognizing that being and nothing are purely abstract and therefore don't mean anything. But he's incorrect in then thinking that that's what he's applying when we're talking about, or talking about like determinate things, defined things that already exist only because of context. And also, Kant doesn't make the difference between what a real infinite being and just a supposedly infinite being is. Because in regular theology, the mistake is real. The critique Kant makes is fitting if by God you mean something which is not truly infinite. Something that's like God is the greatest being, a being that one can conceive. That makes God relative. That makes God actually finite. And if that's your conception of God, then Kant's critique holds. But if that's not your conception of God, if your conception of God is necessarily what philosophy needs, which is it has to be infinite, like no stops, no limitation, then this cannot be true. In such a being, there can be no difference between thought and being because what? well, the being will itself hold thought within it. And this thought will be, and all these other things. It is the very ground of existence. Just to note for the recording, one of the group members says that Kant criticizes dialectical ideas, antinomies of reason. He criticizes the cosmological ideas, that is there a necessary being or not? The point is that both positions are logically valid. They are just built from pure rationalism or empiricism, and by principle of no third option, Kant says they're both invalid. But there is always a dialectical unity with finitude in these ideas of infinity. So Kant in the end falls into mysticism in a sense that he can't declare what is real. And this is important. He notes that if we take Hegel's position, synthetic a priori judgments are impossible for Kant because pure thought without empirical sense is, in a sense, form without content, and Hegel obviously denies that this is possible. And indeed, it basically shows very clearly in Kant's own presentation of how he has to externally make the synthetic a priori connect. He doesn't actually do it immanently. So, and I agree with it. I think that Kant has to rely on a priori recollection in order to, as well as subjective, arbitrary determination of how these things come together at all. So Kant sees there is some kind of connection. He never quite gets what the connection really is. And just to kind of spell it out, since Hegel believes that the ontological argument in principle actually can work, but obviously nobody's had the right conception of the argument, guess what the argument actually is? Well, the real ontological argument, according to Hegel, is going to be his entire system. Because he thinks that in his entire system he proves that indeed, being and concept are one in God.
Because the ontological proof of God deals with a definition of God which is particularly abstract.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
The classical ontological proof of God deals with a definition which is particularly, especially very abstract. So that is why it's easy to say that Kant is correct in that way, as criticizing a very abstract notion.
Yeah, it's abstract, and it's also has a misconception of God, it still makes a difference between God and the everything, the totality of reality. So it makes God finite, so that's part of its problem. One is that it's abstract, it doesn't have the right concept of God as infinite, and it doesn't have, therefore, also the actual derivation of a real argument.
So when we proceed by the Hegelian method of um, proceeding by determinations and more concreteness, we should be able to derive the existing from the conceptual, right?
In a way, if yes, in a way, no. In which, obviously Hegel's because the system is going to be in our head, we're the ones who are going to think it. They're still going, for us, they're still going, we can easily be tempted to say, well, it really doesn't apply. The system, sure, it exists. It's absolute in my head, but, does that actually exist in reality? And depending on how you look at it, yes and no. In the fact that if you can indeed finish the system in your head, you can think through it, you should be then convinced, obviously, since you worked it out imminently, that you've done it. You've actually gone from being right down to, the very structures of your own determinate reality. You're not going to be getting to the empirical reality, but you get to the structures of it. You see the structure of the absolute, what the empirical, sensuous absolute is. Well, that was kind of already the presupposition, we have, even in science, we have this presupposition that obviously the world is one. If it wasn't, we wouldn't be, really bothering with, searching for unifying theories and finding out what the common phenomena underlying, the common things underlying disparate phenomena are. We have this just natural rational intuition that there is a unity to everything somehow. Somehow everything coheres in a way. It wouldn't make sense otherwise. And Hegel's system is supposed to be the rational understanding, comprehension of how this is actually possible to understand as a single unity, which is also differentiated and manifold and all these things. So it's because Hegel doesn't begin with this assumption of God. Hegel says at the beginning in the introductory essays, he's by what we're going to be by what the spirit of religion meant to say by God, not what it says about God. Hegel's not interested in proving a specific God. He's actually just proving that this idea of an absolute unified being, this intuition that we have, is correct. It's just not going to be correct in these abstract senses which he have thought about it the entire time, in history up to him. Because, he agrees with, say, for example, Spinoza, in which, Spinoza has a proper understanding of God, in which, he gets this idea of infinity. Substance is everything, but it's still an abstract definition of it. He doesn't really get at the concept of God. He doesn't really get at what it takes to think God. So, just to put it out there, Hegel is not really interested in theology as such. If this has anything to do with theology, it's because he doesn't want to leave anything out. He wants to say, this intuition of religion, in which this idea of God is the ultimate being, is partially a correct intuition. There is truth to it, but how it's being presented obviously cannot be true, because it actually isn't truly infinite. And when it is properly understood as truly infinite, it's only understood abstractly, so they don't really have the concept of God. So the aim in all of this is not to prove that God exists. It just so happens that something like what we intended, really deep down intended to mean by God is going to show itself to be the case. So, my own take is I don't really put too much importance on this. It's just kind of a curious, really, it doesn't really jive with what most people would hope an ontological argument would be. It's not going to prove the Christian God. It's not going to prove that kind of God. And so what Hegel means by God is obviously not what almost anybody means by God. And, you get to that point in which, people then say, what is actually theistic about this? What's the point of calling it God? All right, can we go on to Remark 2? Remark 2 is going to be longer. We're just going to, start a couple paragraphs and discuss that, and we'll leave it for the next time. One of the members here says, I think it is important to explain that Hegel overcomes dualism, such as Descartes' sense of material beings and rational beings. Hegel does definitely overcome that eventually. So far in the logic, this is not going to be really a question, because we're not even starting with any presupposition of beings as such. Insofar as we're talking about these concepts and investigating them, we're not even dealing with them with the determinacy as concepts. We're just thinking, and that's kind of all we're supposed to do. We're just supposed to be presented with these concepts, don't even think about them as, the difference between thought and existence. That's an external reflection. So, we're just supposed to think about these things, and eventually we'll get to this whole, in nature you'll start getting to this point in which, I've actually finally thought about something empirical, in which you notice, then there is a connection between thinking and being, which is not an absolute difference, and actually is an immanent connection. Because just to make sure, Hegel is no fool. Hegel doesn't think that thoughts in your head are obviously beings outside of your head. Things that exist spatio-temporally, materially, etc. He's not making that kind of collapse. But that's a difference that is irrelevant at this point. All right, Remark 2. Well, I think we'll just probably get through one paragraph or two, and then we'll call it a day. Yet another reason can be cited that helps to explain the resistance to the proposition about being and nothing. This reason is that, as expressed in the proposition, being and nothing are one and the same, the result of considering being and nothing is incomplete. The accent falls primarily on the being one and the same, as is the case in judgment generally, where the predicate says that what the subject is. So just make note of this, because this is important, by the way. This, if you ever read Hegel scholarship, this actually comes up frequently enough, but not very frequently, and it's a very important topic, which is speculative propositions. Hegel doesn't like specifically call them that right here, but he talks about it in the Phenomenology and other places, which he's going to explain that the speculative way to read this is very different from how people normally read things, even though we actually do this all the time and don't realize that we do this. But the problem is that we do it we either, one, do it inconsistently, or two, we apply it where it doesn't actually apply. So yes, actually, if you've ever read like Russell's critique of Hegel, it shows you that Russell didn't read Hegel because literally in Chapter 1, Hegel denies the very thing Russell charges Hegel with, which is Russell says Hegel makes the copula is like an equal sign, that which just collapses all differences and says everything's the same. And Hegel's literally right here saying the problem with thinking that is that that's not the proper way to read it. That's not how speculative propositions work. So, when you think that being and nothing are one and the same means that the accent falls primarily on the being one and the same, as is the case in judgment generally, where the predicate says what the subject is, you're misreading it. You're not understanding what he's saying. Consequently, the sense seems to be that the distinction is denied, which yet patently occurs in the proposition at the same time. For the proposition says both determinations, being and nothing, and contains them as distinguished. At the same time, the meaning cannot be that abstraction ought to be made from the two determinations and only the unity retained. This sense would be manifestly one-sided, since that from which abstraction would be made is equally present in the proposition explicitly named here. Now, insofar as the proposition being and nothing are the same expresses the identity of these determinations, yet in fact equally contains the two as distinguished, it internally contradicts itself and thus dissolves itself. I mean, to summarize that, if what you think that would mean is that there is a collapse, and that there really is no and what Hegel's saying is there really is no difference. Hegel says no, don't do that, because if there really was no difference, why the hell would we start with a difference in the first place to realize, oh, there was no difference? The difference is not an illusion. And people make this mistake with Hegel. They call Hegel a monist when Hegel is absolutely not a monist. Hegel does not think that everything can be reduced to a unity. If that was the case, difference could not be made sense of. Even by saying, well, look, then difference is just an illusion, everything really is one, you are the one who's being delusional, because clearly the difference is there. If it wasn't, you wouldn't have to be so obstinate about saying, it's an illusion and there really is just one and the same thing. You can't be this reductive in saying, well, look, everything really is one thing, everything really is matter, and then anyone who just has common sense will tell you, well, that's nonsense though. How can you say everything is matter when there's clearly things like thinking, there's things like life, there's things like forces? How is it that these things can be called matter when it seems very clear to us that they're not? And then you get all these other convolutions of it's actually just like it's either illusory, or it's just like you get these weird theories like supervenience, in which it's sort of kind of real but not really. The real is really one thing. It becomes nonsense. So, main point to get out of that is, in order to get a unity, you actually have to have a difference. And neither one nor the other can be more real or more fundamental. So in order to think about it properly, you have to take both into account, in their respective senses and the limits to which those senses can be, thought through. The limits to which they are actually intelligible. So continuing, now insofar as the proposition being nothing are the same expresses the identity of these determinations, yet in fact equally contains the two as distinguished, it internally contradicts itself and thus dissolves itself. And if we concentrate on this result, what we have before us is a proposition which, on closer inspection, turns out to vanish spontaneously. It has movement, but in thus vanishing, it is its proper content which comes to be in it, namely becoming. So that last sentence is a bit of the last two sentences is a bit of a Hegel playing word games. Which is, if you can say that, and you can see how it properly is understood, it nonetheless appears to you as utter nonsense and dissolves itself. And remember that becoming is this vanishing, this dissolution, which being and nothing do. And so even if you're not thinking about being and nothing in the their respective moments of indeterminacy, which then you turn into each other, if you think about this in propositional form, a full proposition, the result, he says, is nonetheless more or less the same. If you properly understand the proposition, it will do exactly what you need it to do, which is to reveal to you that there is a becoming. The contradiction dissolves itself, it vanishes, and if you understand vanishing properly, you'll know that it's becoming, and then you can start talking about, how becoming works. But of course, that's an external reflection, which is not how Hegel really wants to do it. But he says, if we had to, we could sort of guide you from an external reflection to see this same truth, basically in an undialectical fashion. Let's see. This is from the group chat. Being and nothing are identical and different. In the same time, we can only get content by being by counterposing nothing. That is the problem of both empiricists and rationalists in Kant's critique, that they take one position as fundamental. They don't understand the threat that there is a dialectical unity. And Hegel's solution is that we, on principle of identity of counterposing ideas, we get content in a sense in their dialectical unity. Yeah, I agree with that. But still, one has to realize that these judgments of identity and difference are judgments from far more advanced points in the logic, And in you ought to notice how difficult this is, really, to think about if you didn't already have a standpoint which allowed you to see this. Here's where Hegel's supposed a priori includes the a posteriori. It's like this rational deduction which is going on, this dialogue, this immanent dialectical deduction which he's making out of these categories is not really purely a priori. You know, you're reconstructing them in an a priori fashion, but obviously you have to have so much experience of actual, you know, life and the history of philosophy to have all these tools in hand to be able to see that this rational reconstruction is possible and to be able to do it, you know, justice. So Hegel says, yes, you know, we're using all of these we're using these tools from, like, you know, far beyond other developments which we have not gone to yet. You know, and we're using these to sort of like make you comfortable with making sense of this, but don't make the mistake of thinking that from this standpoint so far we can legitimately make these external judgments. Another one has asked, is then the concept of non-being useless in comparison to that of nothing because of being static? Sorry to be so stubborn. No, the reason we didn't, like, the whole problem about non-being was that it implied too much, but it implies enough. You know, we could, from non-being, unpack becoming. In the exact same way that Hegel mentions that this proposition can be unpacked into becoming. That the very self-reference of non-being to being is contradictory. You know, the term unites things which are contradictory, and therefore, if properly understood, will dissolve itself. It will vanish, and, you know, it should get you to becoming. But that is an external reflection. So we can definitely use non-being, but as far as the necessity of how to go about this in the structure of science in Hegel's sense, you know, we couldn't use it because it just implies too much. Sorath, I have this intuition that becoming kind of resembles the concept of appearance, co-appearance in the phenomenology. Yes, appearance is definitely one of those concepts which is itself transitory. You will see this in the science of logic. We'll get to in the chapter 2. There is one specific concept which is purely transitory, which immediately transitions to something else which is more stable. Concepts which are purely transitory are sort of like higher versions, which instantiate a more concrete becoming. But becoming is more than just this pure moment of becoming. You will notice that. Another one says, if we didn't establish identity, thinking would come to stop, and we can't say anything. I think that is his main motivation in establishing identity between being and nothing. Yeah, that is if you're really stubborn. Like these remarks are if you really are stubborn and aren't willing to accept what he says, and it's just him trying to coax you into making sense of why it makes sense that he should do this, and that what he says, is not some grand violation of all reason, and that he's just talking nonsense. These are it's a sort of skillful means to get you to understand what he's trying to say. The aim, however, is not to get you to understand it in this manner, which is external, but in the manner in which it is internal, so that you can see how this immanently arises and makes sense. So all this talk about, the speculative proposition, the identity, and non-identity, these are external reflections. And the ideal is not to ultimately think about it with these reflections, but to see it immanently in the concept itself without having to rely on these. These reflections will arise as possible reflections once we developed the very concept of identity and difference. But that's a long way off. So, I mean, just to rephrase that, these things do make sense, and he's making sense of them with tools which, at that point, are external. The goal is for you to realize you don't need those tools at this point. That the tools can definitely be applied, but at this point they're just not. They're neither possible to legitimately use, nor actually necessary to use. You don't have to think in terms of the law of identity or the law of difference or the law of non-contradiction. You only have to do it. In doing it, eventually the reflection will come about that you have done these things. But that's an afterthought. That's a recollection which will come further down the line. The goal is for you to just do it, notice what it is that you're doing, and just think about it. In that eminence. Is the nothing in non-being different from that of nothing itself because the latter is pure and the former is the result of non-being becoming nothing? Non-being is different from nothing because non-being already makes an imminent connection to being. It's non-being. Nothing is supposed to be this utterly different thing from being. That's why Hegel doesn't want to use it. And yes, it already includes becoming. It is already a determinate concept. So it's like part of what I keep saying every time it's brought up. Non-being is correct, but it says too much. Yes, pure non-being could be defined as nothing. Obviously, I mean, it's just a name, basically, you're using. The thing is, Hegel says the reason he doesn't use it is because the name, even if it were just a name and you meant nothing, implies for you, if you do not understand that it is something wholly independent of being, that it's not supposed to be in relation to being or against being. Non-being, in the very way it's written, just naturally implies to you that there is a connection of being, and he doesn't want you to have this idea. If you could get rid of that idea, then it's fine. Non-being, nothing, same thing. Hegel's being more explicit when he uses non-being. Think about it literally. The very way it is written already relates it to being, and Hegel doesn't want you to relate it to being. He doesn't want you to think of nothing as opposed to being. He wants you to just think nothing as such. I mean, yeah, so it's actually not a conceptual problem. Like, the problem is simply non-being would confuse things if you were to read this literally. And by the way, as I said, in I think the first session I mentioned this, you should be reading this, I think, very literally. Like, when Hegel says something, take it, the wording, the phrasing is very important. It's phrased that not in some deep esoteric sense. Often it's phrased in a very brute, literal sense in which the very thing is that's said is exactly what is meant. And like the very way it's written is very important because it will imply things, which are he wants to imply and things which he doesn't want to imply. So, if you were reading this properly, which is literally, I think, non-being would definitely trip you up because you're already making a connection between nothing and being, and he doesn't want you to do that. Yeah, the remarks are expansions of, in order to try to make you understand, in case you don't understand. So these remarks are just sort of expanding on like the issues which you, the normal reader, will have, and I think it's obvious that most people need these remarks because otherwise they're very stubborn and just won't accept what Hegel says. They just won't take him at his word, and what you should be doing is trying to take him at his word literally. And so is that thing about non-being cleared up yet? I mean, I got no problem like expanding on it. Uh, well, you guess or you're sure? Hmm. Okay. I think part of the problem is that if English is not your native language, this whole problem would seem to you a strange non-problem, because I mean this is literally just a linguistic quibble that he's like making about that if in your language whatever it is that you call being, and just put like whatever non-being translates to, it implies things if you read it literally. So I mean, it's not a conceptual quibble. Like it's literally just a linguistic thing. That if you wanted to say non-being, but you thought about it literally, then it would be a problem. If not, then it really is not a problem. You could call it whatever you want. You could call nothing cats. You could call it being dogs. So long as what you meant was exactly what he wants you to structurally mean, it's fine. Whatever you call it. Yeah, it's not a conceptual. Okay, like to clarify that, it's not a conceptual difference. It's a linguistic problem. He's saying that in non-being, you may, if you thought about it literally, be tempted to make the immediate connection back to being from, instead of thinking about it as a pure other thing. But if you don't make that connection, well, then there's no problem. So in case, you linguistically thought about it, then, his explanation will be meaningful. If you didn't linguistically think about it and you just thought, well, he's already told us it's got indeterminate thing, it's purely itself, then no problem at all. Non-cat. It is cat and non-cat. Just like Schrödinger. Actually, that may be an example. Think about it this way. If you, instead of being, you called it cat, but just use cat as a name. And you wanted to talk about something absolutely different from a cat in itself. And instead of calling it like dog, you will say, well, no, it's just, maybe I just want to call it non-cat. What does that make? That leaves a huge temptation to constantly refer that thing, which is not a cat and has no relation to cats, back to cats, even though there should be nothing whatsoever connecting them. Because you're comparing it. By saying it's not a cat, you're comparing it to cat. And Hegel says, but if it's really not a cat, and it's absolute, then it has no relation to cat whatsoever. So why are you referring back to cat, if it's just a name, great, but it leaves this temptation in which you might constantly want to be referring back to cat, even though it has nothing to do with cat. Maybe it's a dog, if a dog indeed is a non-cat, it's not a cat, but do you have to talk about dog in the sense of cats, refer it back to cats? No, you can talk about a dog as a dog. And that's what Hegel wants you to do with nothing. He wants you to think about nothing just as nothing, not nothing as a non-being. So, I hope that makes it more obvious why the linguistic problem is there. That if you, instead of calling a dog and cat, you would say cat and non-cat. Dog and cat tells you, well, it's a dog and it's a cat, and they have nothing to do with each other. A cat is a cat, a dog is a dog. But if you say non-cat, there is a temptation, very strong temptation in the very language, to think of it in relation to a cat. I mean, makes sense? All right, is that clear now? All right, that's good. This linguistic thing will come up again with other terms. So, and the fact that he mentions them is just in the case that you think something would make sense to say, and he will say, yes, if you meant what I said, it would be fine. But chances are that you don't realize that in the way you say it, you're very tempted to mean something else. So, right, we've been going for about 2 hours, and I think that's good enough Hegel for most people for any day. So we'll leave this until next Saturday, in which we'll continue on with Remark 2. How far did we go? How many pages was that? Five pages. Yeah, that's about right for Hegel. I mean, 5 pages in 2 hours. Hey, at least it wasn't like literally like 2 paragraphs for 5 days, 12 hours a day. That happened to me once, man. It wasn't fun. Well, actually, no, I had great fun. But anyways, thank you all for showing up. I hope this was helpful. I did record it, unless somehow things screwed up. So I'll go through the recording, like even out the audio, and I will put that up as soon as I can.